Good evening, everybody, and welcome if you are here waiting for our Bible phrase that takes our breath away. And it is 5:30, so we shall begin. Hope your Thursday has gone well. In these little talks on Thursdays, we look at phrases which the early listeners of the Bible narratives may have just been startled or paused or wondered, this may be quite important. And our one today is taken from a time in history when the people of Israel had been taken into exile, and they were in Babylon, and various things happened. And a few years on, here's the phrase: the king watched the hand as it wrote. The king watched the hand as it wrote. We have probably heard of the phrase, the writings on the wall. In fact, that phrase doesn't appear exactly like that in this narrative, but the phrase is taken from this account of what happened. At this point, the king watched the hand as it wrote. This is from Daniel chapter 5. Who is the king? It's King Belshazzar. And he thinks pretty much he is the greatest king ever. And he's called together a huge feast, and 1,000 nobles are there, and they're all having a great and an exotic time. So much that after a little bit of drinking and eating, Belshazzar thought it'd be fun to bring in the vessels that the captured, the exiled Israelite people had brought with them many years before. And these were precious to them. And Belshazzar said, let's just use them in our feast, and let's serve food and drink out of them and maybe throw them around. He was trampling on their dreams a little bit, trampling on their sacred things. First thing we may note is that if something is very precious to somebody else, then it's probably not a good direction to seek to trample on that. The feast was going really well. 1,000 nobles, most important king in the world, Belshazzar would have thought, in total control, can even get those old vessels from that captured people and bring them as well. I can do anything. And then a hand appears and writes on the wall. And the king watched the hand as it wrote. I bet he did. Because what was it going to say? And at that time, of course, nobody knew if this was going to be big, affirming words. Well done, Belshazzar, you are the greatest king in history, etc., or whether there was something else going on. But what they would have all realized is that Belshazzar may think he's powerful, but there is clearly a greater power that can produce a hand that writes across the wall. So the king watches it. Obviously, everybody would have been watching it who had noticed it, but the narrator wants us to hear that the king is watching it so closely, because maybe it's something for him. He establishes control, or tries to, or re-establishes control, and says, I want to know what this writing means, and send for my wisest, my bestest men, and let them come and interpret. Because still at that moment, people don't know what it says. It's in a language that they cannot follow. That almost must have been a letdown. What has the hand written? Words, I think, but I can't understand the words. So we need to go to the next stage. Let's find someone who can interpret. And nobody can. And then someone remembers Daniel, a member of the Israelite community in exile, who in fact had been a faithful servant to Belshazzar's father, Nebuchadnezzar. He is remembered and he's brought in. And this could be Daniel's big moment. But remember, he is part of the despised, exiled Israelite nation. But they bring him in because they don't know where else to turn. Daniel has a choice, and he can either say, well, actually what the hand is saying, Belshazzar, is that you are very, very wonderful, and please make me your prime minister, and etc., etc. Or he could say the truth. And sometimes in modern life, we come across the phrase, speaking truth to power. And this is exactly what's going on here. And Daniel speaks truth to power. He translates the words. This was the inscription that was written now towards the end of chapter 5 of Daniel. Mene, mene, tekel parsin. This is what the words mean. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. That's not good news to hear in the middle of the feast. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. That's quite challenging. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Belshazzar, to give him his due, fulfills his promise. He had wanted to laden Daniel with gifts, but Daniel had said, no, I don't want any of those, just do the translating. But Belshazzar does get a purple robe and give it to Daniel, and he was proclaimed as important in the nation. So speaking truth to power sometimes yields good results. And then the last verse, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. The age of 62 is a nice specific reference by the historian. We don't really need to know that, except he knows that fact and just wants to put that in. And Belshazzar's reign is over. What is there here for us? I suppose there's always the reminder that if ever we think we are the most important person in our little universe, just to remember that there is a higher power, and a power that could produce in these circumstances a hand that writes across the wall. Secondly, that we are accountable. For Belshazzar, he had to hear those words, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And thirdly, perhaps the example of Daniel, who was honest and brave and said what he knew to be right. The next Thursday, we'll be looking at a great phrase that occurs in Darius's reign, and again it's to do with Daniel, before one of the most famous stories of all in the Bible. I don't know if you've ever seen the picture by Rembrandt of Belshazzar's feast. I think it's in the National Gallery in London, which sadly we can't go to and see in these days, but when it's open, do have a look, or do look it up online. And it captures that moment of shock when the most important person in the kingdom, in his own eyes, perhaps most important person in the world, someone who felt that he could trample on others' sacred dreams, suddenly realized that there is a bigger story and a bigger power, and he is accountable there. Thank you so much for listening this evening. The king watched the hand as it wrote, and I'm sure he did.